In this video, we're going to talk about some best practices when handling exceptions in Java. This tends to be a bit of a tricky subject for some individuals when they start learning Java because the syntax can be a little bit goofy. So in this video, we'll talk about what exceptions are, and then we'll show some examples and what might be a follow-up video to this. So an exception happens when something goes wrong, and we generally classify them into two different categories in Java. A checked exception is when something happens because of an activity that you've taken in your program. In other words, you're likely to get a file not found exception if you're trying to open a file or write to a file. That's a distinct operation that will throw a file not found exception. You wouldn't get that if you were just prompting the user or sending something to standard output. You would get it only when you're trying to access a file. A SQL exception is similar because you'd only get it when you're trying to connect to a database. So in these cases, these are considered checked exceptions where Java requires that you make some decision based on what could go wrong. So it requires that you have a plan to handle something going wrong. So if the file's not found, what do? Do you tell the user maybe there is no file at this location, or do you go to a different location? If there's a SQL exception, or you're unable to connect to the database, how do you handle that? Java requires that you think about that by providing checked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions should be prevented, but are not specific to a context. In other words, a number format exception happens when you take a string of data and you try to convert it to a number, but the characters inside that string are not actually a number. Array index out of bounds exceptions happens when you try to access an index of an array that does not exist. What do you do with exceptions, or what does an exception look like? First of all, we'll have a try block, and by block, recall that means we have open curly and close curly. Anything that might throw an exception belongs in that try. Now there's the catch block that follows the try and has a syntax that looks like this. This is where you say, if something goes wrong, I'm going to handle it in this catch block. Now, that's if you're going to handle the exception locally, and we'll talk about some best practices for that in just a moment. You have another option, though, which is to throw an exception back to the method who called you. And if you do that, you're leaving the responsibility of fixing this exception or remedying the exception or working around the exception to the method that called you. In that case, we'll have a syntax that looks like this. We'll add throws exception to the method signature to indicate that this method will throw an exception. And then the point where we want to throw the exception, we use this kind of syntax, throw E. So you see two ways to handle an exception. One is to catch it, have a catch block, which will handle it. The other is to throw it up to the method that calls us and let that decide how to fix it. Some good exception best practices. And I put a flow chart together that explains this just as well. So basically, if we get an exception, if something goes wrong, let's ask ourselves, can I handle it locally? Do I know enough about this exception to handle it locally? If so, then we want to implement a try-catch. If I cannot handle it locally, if it's something where I don't know the answer to it, then I'm going to ask, am I in the UI layer? If I'm not in the UI layer, I'm going to throw the exception up. And it will go up until it hits a method that's in the UI layer. So now let's take a look at, am I in the UI layer? And let's say, in this case, yes. If I'm in the UI layer, then what I want to do is show a message to the user depending on the exception. We don't want to give the user too many details, but we might want to say, sorry, I cannot access your data right now. Please try again later. Or something to that effect that just lets the user know that the software cannot operate fully at the moment. So, can you handle it locally? Use a try-catch. If you're not, throw it to the calling layer. If you are in the UI layer and you cannot handle it locally, inform the user of the error, but don't give too many details. Number one, it's confusing. Number two, you don't want to arm someone who might be trying to hack your system. Okay, some things we don't want to do with exceptions. Never leave a catch block empty, because what happens then is we are taking some very valuable information, which is information on why the program stopped working, and we're throwing it away. I'm going to make a corollary to this one, and I'm going to say never return null. Never return null. This is one that I see a lot when I'm grading projects, and this is a major no-no because in that case, if you return null, you're probably going to get a null pointer exception, which is going to be an even worse exception than the one that you just caught, because null pointer exceptions typically carry very little information about what happened. So if you catch an exception, you get a lot of good information about why the exception happened. If you throw that away and just return null out of the catch block, then you're throwing away all that very good information. I recommend against using system out print line. System out print line is what I see when someone doesn't know how to debug. I would prefer to use the debugger. In a running program, I would use true logging, like log4j logging, where we can set thresholds with our messages. We can say a message is fatal because the program's crashing, or there was an error, or warn, or info, or debug. We can give our messages actual different priority levels, which is something we can't do with system out print line. Don't just catch to rethrow. Sometimes I'll see a catch block that immediately rethrows an exception. I'd advise against that because just don't put the try catch in there and the exception will automatically rethrow. For try blocks, don't make them any longer than they need to be. In other words, don't make the try block the length of the entire method. This is another important one. If you have code that requires the try block syntax to work, then keep it in the try block. A lot of times I'll see something like a try block where somebody is opening a file, and then there's the catch, and then immediately after the catch, there's some operation related to that file. Well, if there's an operation that depends on that file properly being opened, then it should be within the try block itself. So that's an overview of exceptions. In the next few videos, we'll take a look at some examples. I'll see you in those. Thank you.